Sir, welcome to UATV. It's always a huge privilege to have you here. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for the privilege. I am worried about our soldiers and sailors and airmen who are engaged in combat operations in the Middle East right now. But personally, I'm doing okay.
Every year we hear the same question over and over again. Will this year be the last? And in one of your recent interviews, you said that Russia is not interested in ending the war soon. What concrete battlefield or political indicators should our viewers anticipate to know when Moscow actually is ready to negotiate?
I think that the Kremlin will continue doing this as long as they think they have a chance to win, which means that Ukraine collapses or that support for Ukraine in Europe collapses. So as long as they believe that outside pressure will force Ukraine to take a bad deal, I think they will continue. So the thing I would be looking for is indicators that the Europeans, for example, are going to continue to support Ukraine. Uh, Unfortunately, I don't think my own country, under the current administration, is going to do much to help, which I think is a terrible mistake on our part. But that's how I see it. In fact, I'm sure the Russians do not have the ability to overwhelm or break through Ukrainian defenses. So the situation on the ground today, it'll look a lot like this a year from now because Ukraine also does not have the ability by itself to push Russia out. I imagine that the Russians will continue their attacks on Ukrainian civilian targets and infrastructure unless and until Ukraine is able to make that infeasible for them by increasing air defense capabilities and also destroying the places and the factories from which those Russian attacks are happening. And then finally, I do think that Ukraine has identified a path to victory, which is the destruction of Russia's ability to export oil and gas. So, in addition to knocking out their refineries, seeing with help from the Europeans to stop the shadow fleet vessels from taking oil out through the Baltic Sea and Black Sea, those would be very positive indicators.
Do you think that Russians currently heavily rely on external pressure on Ukraine?
Well, they assume that the U.S. president is going to keep doing that. I mean, that it's it's been difficult for me to watch, and I'm sure it must be agonizing for Ukrainians to see this, that an American president has, by and large, taken the Russian perspective and approach on all of this, um, even though most of the Congress and most of America supports Ukraine. That could change, but I don't see any indicators right now that it's going to change, that the U.S. is going to change its approach.
Russian forces are reportedly losing thousands of troops per mile in some sectors in Ukraine. Does that signal strategic failure, or does it actually show that Russia can sustain attritional warfare longer than the West expected?
I think there is a theory about attrition warfare that the Russians can do this forever because they have such a big country and they don't care about casualties and you know that's the way it's always been for them and so there is a theory that says they can do this indefinitely. I don't think so. I don't know where that tipping point is, but it's some place both physically but also psychologically. Um, Ukraine is killing more Russians than Russia is able to uh, take into the armed forces. So it's not an endless amount of manpower. That's why they're, using North Koreans, immigrants, everybody they can find. I don't think that they have really recruited too heavily from Moscow or St. Petersburg yet. So if they become very desperate, then we may see a broader mobilization. But based on the last few months and some battlefield adaptations that the Ukrainian side has made, I think it is feasible that Ukraine could kill more Russians than the Russians can bring in as replacements. And of course, having bodies does not equal having an effective force. I mean, they have to be trained, equipped, organized, etc. I don't know how effective that is at this point. But I would certainly imagine what's going on now on the ground is going to continue all throughout the rest of this year and on into next year, unless something significant happens externally.
And speaking of the mobilization, do you think there is a chance for a new mobilization in Russia? Are there maybe some indications?
Of course, there's a chance. Um, I think that the Kremlin has wanted to avoid this because then it would be obvious that even after 4 years of large-scale invasion and 12 years of since the original invasion, that they have been unsuccessful. That would be difficult to explain, and I think that even Putin has to be conscious of and respond to some public opinions and sentiment. Um, but at some point, they'll have to make a judgment. And as long as they are able to make enough money from the sale of oil and gas to China and India and other customers, I think they will continue to do what they're doing.
The latest peace talks between the US, Ukraine, and Russia in Geneva, unfortunately, again, produced no meaningful results. Are negotiations now just strategic theater for domestic audience? What does it look like to you?
Well, I think on the Russian side, it's just theater. I've seen zero indication as an outsider watching. I've seen zero indication that they are serious about getting to a just, sustainable peace that is acceptable to Ukraine. I have not seen any real indicators that the Russians are prepared to back away from their demands that have been there from the beginning. Now, of course, the Ukrainian negotiation team and the Ukrainian leadership will have a better sense of this than I would. So I would trust their judgment, but I don't see any indicator that Russia's genuinely interested in getting to a peaceful conclusion because they still think that the U.S. is not going to intervene in a meaningful way against Russia, and they still are skeptical that Europe is prepared to do whatever is necessary to help Ukraine. So they'll continue this sort of theater. On the Ukrainian side, of course, I can't guess. I would only be guessing about how the Ukrainian side sees things. I can understand why there would be a desire to stay involved in hopes that the Trump administration will change their approach or at least continue to provide certain things. Although now, given the amount of weapons that are being used against Iran, I don't know how much of the like Patriot, for example, or things are available for the U.S. to sell to European allies to give to Ukraine. So that leverage, I don't know how significant that is.
Does a Middle East war weaken Western focus on Ukraine? And if so, how crucial is it for Ukraine?
Well, it certainly is going to divert some energy, intellectual energy, perhaps some intelligence capabilities, and as we just discussed, perhaps less preferred munitions being available to sell to European allies to give to Ukraine. On the other hand, this is demonstrating that Russia is unable to help another of their allies. I mean, they did nothing to help Armenia. They did nothing to help Syria. They've done nothing now to be able to help Iran. And I think it's because they are so stretched against Ukraine. And in my view, it gives lie to this assessment that somehow Russian victory is inevitable. I don't think so. In fact, I'm sure it's not inevitable, and most Ukrainians, I believe, would believe that also. Um, for other European countries, other allies, um, have, I think, frankly, are not convinced of the justification by the Trump administration for why they attacked Iran. So you don't see any British, for example, or German or Polish or Italian or others involved in the actual operations, other than the fact that the Iranians have hit Cyprus now, and I would imagine that Crete and Incirlik are bases that the Iranians could strike if they were able to. So it's not like there's no effect, but I don't see this as a significant distraction for countries to prevent them from doing what they were already doing for Ukraine.
Sir, I wanted to ask you this. Several intelligence agencies predicted that Russia can invade Europe before the end of the decade. But at the same time, we can see that Russia is very much involved in war against Ukraine. And at the same time, they also stockpile their weaponry, they expand their bases along the borders with NATO countries. What are the chances for Russia to have significant or at least somehow successful invasion of any given European country?
Well, the best way to make sure that Russia never attacks the rest of Europe is to make sure that Ukraine is successful against Russia. Ukraine, as a European country, obviously is on the front line, and Russia, still after 12 years, only controls 21% of Ukraine. So I think that you can't discount the possibility that Russia would seek to do something elsewhere to uh, distract or disrupt Europe's support for Ukraine. I think all these gray zone operations, the main purpose of them is to put pressure on governments to stop supporting Ukraine, so that because populations get scared. Um, so it seems to me very unlikely that Russia could or will attack another European country while they are struggling against Ukraine. But I wouldn't rule it out. The most likely scenario would be 1 or 2 years after whatever sort of outcome we have with Ukraine and Russia would be the soonest that they might be prepared to actually do something. Um, and of course, an attack on, let's say, Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, I think would be for the purpose of breaking NATO, not to take over all of Europe, but to demonstrate that the alliance is not willing to actually come to the aid of, you know, Latvia if there was a Russian attack around Daugavpils, for example. So these are the kind of things I think that the alliance is preparing for, those kinds of possibilities. And I wouldn't rule it out. But I think most experts agree that helping Ukraine defeat Russia is the absolute best investment you can make.
Absolutely. And if Europe doesn't dramatically expand defense production now, are we watching the slow collapse of deterrence? And does this deterrence work at all nowadays?
I would say, um, if you don't have ammunition and if you don't have capability, then you don't have deterrence. Deterrence, the theory of deterrence, is based on capability that's demonstrated and willpower to use that capability that is demonstrated. The Russians have to believe that the alliance has that capability and is prepared to use it. So that's the critical factor. Um, the fact that so many people question whether or not the United States would actually still do something is a problem, because that could lead to the Russians making a terrible miscalculation that the U.S. would not respond. I absolutely believe the United States would respond. It's in our own interest, not just because it's a treaty obligation. So deterrence does work, but only if you have demonstrated capability and will.
Also, sir, you warned that Moscow is already waging hybrid war against the West. And the most dangerous thing about the hybrid war is that we cannot respond to it using conventional warfare. At what point does hybrid aggression legally becomes war? And do you see it happening anywhere in Europe, for example?
So, of course, the whole purpose of what what I call or what others call gray zone operations. Some people call it hybrid. I think gray zone operations might be a more useful term because it is designed to be done in such a way to achieve effects like scaring populations, disrupting communications and financial systems, destruction or disruption of critical infrastructure, all of these things, but they're done in a way, in a gray area, meaning it's difficult to confirm who did it. Now, anybody that's serious knows that Russia is behind most of these things, but you won't see Russian soldiers or people waving a Russian flag doing it. They're typically criminals or other proxies that are hired to do these kinds of things to create that sort of effect. So until Western countries figure out how do you uh, protect your airspace, how do you protect your infrastructure, how do you protect your population in this kind of a gray zone, the Russians will continue doing it. So we've got to figure out how do you inflict consequences on the Russians. Um, and there's been a lot of reluctance by governments because they can't for sure say Russia did that, the attribution part. And I think the key is going to be governments uh, stop treating these things as crime scenes where you have to gather up all the evidence and then make a determination like in a court case. That will never work. Instead, you should start seizing Shadow Fleet vessels, for example. Every time drones shut down somebody's airport, there should be a consequence of some sort. Shooting down drones is a ridiculous approach if you're talking about Copenhagen Airport or Berlin Airport or Munich Airport. Um, the That's not going to solve the problem. There has to be a much more robust approach to find out who's doing this, where are they originating, and then you start inflicting consequences. And in fact, the consequences against Russia might not be directly related to the actual thing that they did. The Russians have to know that we know, and that will take a little bit of political courage, but also explaining to populations what the hell's going on, why this is happening, and this is what we are going to do to protect our populations.
Considering the growing cyber warfare that escalated dramatically in the recent years and all the cases of hybrid warfare around Europe, would you say that we already in the early stages of World War III without admitting it?
You could, but I don't know if that helps strategic thinking. What I care about the most is not the label or the categorization, but what are we doing about it? What is our objective? What do we want to accomplish? And how do we do that? What are our priorities? What are the risks? So some people, they wanted to call this the second Cold War or World War III or whatever, and it politicians need labels or categories to be able to explain to their population what's going on. Um, if that helps, I'm okay with it, but I don't know that that helps saying it's World War III. But this is why I have tried to advocate for people accepting that Russia is at war with us, even if it's not Kinzhal missiles or Shahed drones flying into Bremerhaven or Gdansk or something like that. They are using all their tools to disrupt and distract us.
Sir, thank you so much. As always, it was really insightful.
Alexa, thank you very much for the privilege.